Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, everyone, for attending this morning's meeting with Chief Quinlan and Matrix and the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission. We are at CPD headquarters. Chair Janet Jackson is not available to be with us today. My name is Adam Friedman. I'm with the Mayor's office. I'm staff to this commission, so I will be sitting in her chair, but I am not in any way representing her. Wanted to, first of all, again, thank you for being here. I did explain the format earlier. We do not have an agenda for today, but we do have Chief Quinlan presenting his implementation, some of the recommendations from the Matrix report. And we do also have Richard here from Matrix who will be on hand to answer any questions. Do we have any preliminary things to address? Nothing? Hearing none, seeing none. Chief, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Apologize, I'm waiting for this tech thing here to free up. It's just frozen. Bob, any ideas why it's completely frozen? It's on. Let's see here. My apologies. Nothing ever goes right when you're trying to get something done. Well, let's see if this is going to stay. Hopefully this stays. I got to stay here, don't I, for the mic? Okay. Okay. Let me grab a couple things. Okay, again, thank you very much for your time today. I been traveling in D.C. for down to FBI headquarters, so I had less time than I wanted to prepare more handouts or more presentation materials for you. But with the time I'm given, what I want to do is shoot through the 140 recommendations that Matrix Consulting Group provided, kind of show you where we're at already and where we're headed. With that said, I'd also like to preface this by when I came in February, I had an executive staff retreat as the interim chief, and we basically scrapped everything we had, this organizational chart I'm providing to you, our mission statement, our core values. We started with a blank slate. I took everybody out of their position that they were in, all the deputy chiefs. So no one was trying to build, their area of expertise because they didn't know where they were going to work. We went off site for 2 days, had a facilitator. We developed this complete overhaul of the division, and I implemented a lot of new policies and practices, and some of those you're going to see today. So when we look at the 140 recommendations, you're going to see how far we've already come as we were working with Matrix in anticipation of their report. And I'm doing the same thing in anticipation of your report. Hopefully, we'll be right on the same page as that report comes out, and we'll be ready to move forward on your recommendations as fast as I was able to move on Matrix's recommendations. So look forward to that. Tammy.
Yes. So I heard you say that you did a complete overhaul. Was that just you feeling the need, or was it anticipation of the report?
Actually, a good question. There was certainly anticipation of the report. I knew Matrix was what they were looking at, and I also knew the commission from all the time I spent with you what areas you were looking at, but it was also just the important right thing to do. It wasn't that, in my opinion, anything was going, I got it working for now, thank you. It wasn't that anything was directly wrong in broad scope. It's always things you can tweak, but the idea is this is always evolving. Policing should not be stagnant because the community's expectations aren't stagnant. So all we're doing is maintaining, kind of alliance and alignment with what the community is asking from us. So that's really what drove the overhaul. So what we did was in the, as you'll see, the very first page here is what the division looked like on an organizational chart basis before the reorganization. The second page shows it afterwards. The big things are that I created a public accountability subdivision and put everything that's under public accountability, internal affairs, professional standards bureau, fiscal, human resources, everything that's really costs people money and resource. So I put those all under public accountability. I consolidated patrol operations. I also created a community services subdivision that we had not previously had. So, and focused a lot of our operations on service we could provide to our community. And then with the support of the mayor, I also created a wellness bureau. And with that wellness bureau, we have some guests here today that are going to be able to come in and show you a little bit about what we've been able to create that will work for officers from a wellness standpoint, even though there's more work to do, and also it's going to be an incredible opportunity for us to build relations with the community and especially our youth. So with that said, I'm going to go through a few of these recommendations first, and then we'll move on. So of the 140 recommendations, as the report was released, I already had 53% of these items already completed or in progress. So I think that was a good testament to the preparation that the Division of Police and the vision the division has for moving forward. There are only 9% of the recommendations that we don't agree with or support in their current form. Doesn't mean we can't find some common ground. And I was actually pleased, Mr. Brady said they usually have more like 20-some% recommendations agencies that they work with don't agree with. So I think we're actually ahead of the game there. And also 38% of them, or 53 recommendations, we either agree with, we're willing to do, we're open to the idea. However, it's either a collective bargaining issue, we need more information on exactly what they intended, or it requires funding. And then, of course, there were some things that were missing, were absent, and that's certainly where I think we'll benefit from the commission's work, is that what else, other steps are in the process that need to be done. Excuse me. Real quick, on the third page, the handout I gave you is our revised mission statement. I wanted to make sure we did a couple things. And you'll see as we go through the recommendations that by doing this, we have answered, been responsive to a lot of these recommendations. In the past, it was just that we were in service with a purpose to protect, a passion to persevere, and the utmost pride in our performance. We updated the mission statement to say the men and women of the Columbus Division of Police serve our community guided by our core values, and we changed our core values. This is a big cultural shift for a division. Anyone change their core values, you see them all over the academy out here, the professionalism, respect, integrity, discipline, enthusiasm. We changed it to an acronym of I CARE. So we have integrity is the very first thing. You have to have integrity, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence. So I think that aligns the culture and the thinking of officers as they're engaged in their duties. Community-minded, compassion, accountability, a lot of things that we want to make sure that they know is important to us. So with that in mind, let's go through a few of these. Welcome, Vlad. Okay, there's already 53%, as I said, already identified prior to release. Let's see, 35. Yeah. Okay, 53% are already done. A lot of the recommendations, why some of that is, a lot of them simply say maintain or continue. I think that's a compliment to the Division of Police that Matrix was able to determine that a lot of the things we were already doing require a little additional action, maybe some tweaks here and there, but it's just maintaining and continuing. The recommendations repeatedly throughout the 140, maintain, continue, retain, Those are all, again, showing that what we were doing was very responsive to the principles of 21st century policing and what we were already trying to accomplish. Now, there's 38% of additional recommendations that are consistent with our new mission and our values that we want to do. We're willing to work to get these accomplished. We're already working with vendors. I already have a Benchmark Analytics who's presented to you, is coming into a presentation to some city council, mayor staff, some others. We also have a Mark 43 coming in to look at a different records management system. One of the big recommendations was to basically scrap the Premier One system, which I can't wait to implement that recommendation. But again, these things require funding, or they require some collective bargaining decisions to go along with them. So they're not that we can't get through there, just there's more hurdles and more time needed to go through those legal process that we have through our funding. I want to give you a quick example. This is busy, and I know I don't like busy slides, but I just want to give you a idea of why I say I'm so focused on this records management and CAD system. It didn't specifically address the CAD system, which is computer-aided dispatching, but the RMS records management system is in this report is the Premier One they're talking about. It also says we need to hire 17 sergeants and 79 officers to do the proactive 40% policing we need. Well, if we hire 17 sergeants, we're promoting from officers, so we really need 96 officers. That comes with a price tag of $12 million. That's just a ballpark price. That doesn't include everything or hiring and training and everything else. That's just annual salary, basically. So that's a big price. The RMS CAD is roughly $2 million a year. So what I looked at is we have, just for ballpark numbers, we have 7 officers on a precinct. We have 5 cars and a wagon. So there's 7 cars, say, per precinct. There's 20 precincts, that's 140. So there's 140 officers, 3 shifts a day. Now, I'm not including day midwatch, evening midwatch. I'm not including our CRT teams. I'm not including detectives. I'm just looking at the core of patrol, first, second, third shift. So we got 140 officers, 3 shifts. That's 420 officers working in a day. If we could free up 1 hour for every one of those officers by being more efficient with our CAD and RMS, which is other cities have gone to these cloud-based systems, find that they gain more than that. But let's just say an hour a day times the 420 officers work every day, and that's 365 days a year, 153,000 hours. Officers paid 2,080 hours a year. That's equivalent of 74 officers gained just by freeing up an hour a day by having a more efficient CAD system at $2 million. 105,000 say a year with costs and benefits and everything. That's $7.7 million that would save by hiring this by not needing 74 officers there if the CAD freed those officers up to do proactive police work. We'd still need 22 officers to get to the 96, so that's $2.3 million. Those 22 officers plus the supervisors that we would need at $2 million, and the CAD system, that's $6.3 million. The total cost would be 14 if we did everything by improving the CAD and RMS system. We could save $7.7 million off that $14 million price tag. I think that's worth looking at. I definitely think if we could take the officer we have, because it's going to be a long process to train, and then you got more junior officers out there that are less experienced. Let's take our more seasoned officers, the ones that are experienced. We're already hiring 70 to 80 a year anyways, so we'd have to hire that many more. Let's take what we already have and give them the skills, the ability, and the time to do the job. So I think that's something we'd be fiscally irresponsible if we didn't look at how much we could gain in proactivity by improving just our CAD and RMS system at $2 million a year versus hiring officers at $7.7 million a year. 13 recommendations again. Yes.
So my question is, are you taking into consideration the number of officers that retire. I'll
The
say
number of officers what?
that are retiring in that 22. Because I know
Well-
more than 22 probably retire in a month.
Correct.
Potentially.
That's in addition to what we're already going to hire. What we're already hiring is keeping pace with attrition. So we're not losing officers there, we're hiring and replacing. This is 22 additional officers. Matrix says we need 79. I'm saying we could find a way to get to, we could offset that cost of hiring 96 officers, which would include the sergeants, by freeing up officers and basically freeing up the equivalent of 74 officers.
This will be above and beyond.
So would you increase your class size in the 2 classes, or would you have a 3rd class? Because once upon a time, a long time ago, you had 3 classes.
If we were only needing a difference of 22 officers, that'd be 11 officers per class. We could split, we could, add to that. If we were gonna hire 96 officers, we'd be running classes out here morning, noon, and night. So, with that said, thank you for the questions, good clarification. Again, there's some things that we don't in the current form support, and I'll go through those just briefly. Because there's only 13 of them, I'll just try to flip through those briefly. Must address the significant statistical disparity of use of force against residents, and then it goes on. I'm going to let the professional in the room deal with the significant statistical disparity. That's not my area of expertise. I'm going to focus on the second part of that recommendation. The second part of that recommendation says, by continuing intense training, education, monitoring, and use of force reporting. Well, first of all it's doing is telling us to continue what we're already doing, intense training, education, monitoring, use of force reporting. But we go way beyond that. More than just continue that, we do use of force investigations. We have an entire chain of command from the sergeant, lieutenant, commander, deputy chief review policy decision on use of force. So there's a lot more that goes into just training and monitoring or reporting use of force. It's investigated and it's reviewed all the way through the chain of command. Further, it is looked at, that's individually. Collectively, we do an annual use of force report where the training bureau and everyone in the division can look at and see where are our vulnerabilities, where are our weaknesses, where should we be training differently, what type of trends are we seeing, how can we correct those. So we're always evaluating and training that. And the other thing is we also use our use of force historically with officers to look at early intervention type system that we have right now, or our equivalent years of our early warning system, to look at what they individually are doing that may be problematic. So we do more than just train, educate, monitor, and report. So we do go way beyond that. Here's the bottom line. I'll get to one after I do my bottom line. The bottom line is, based on this recommendation, one outside of policy use of force, which we have a year, one or more, one outside of policy use of force is too many. So whether it is a statistical significant disparity, to me, I'm going to let the experts talk to that. I'm going to say, I'm pointing to one of your commissioners when I say that. I'm going to say one is too many for us. We're always going to work towards 0 on that. So that's where we stay on that. Tammy?
So speaking to use of force, historically this has been a problem in our police department. I know years ago the feds spoke to use of force in communities of color. This report speaks to use of force again. You're saying that you've already taken steps to address or to look at. Can you speak to what that looks like? And also, as you speak to that, can you speak to, in the initial report years ago, this was an issue. And from what I can see, there were things put in place. I don't even know if you were there. I think you were. But what were those things? And then if this is an issue again in the Matrix report, it sounds like what you're saying from this slide is that what you put in place is to investigate. But can you speak more to what that looks like? Is every use of force incident investigated? if there are community complaints about use of force, are those investigated with the same type of guidelines that you use just investigating overall? Can you break that down a little bit more clearly for me?
Yes, thank you for your question. What we do is we investigate every use of force is reported, 100% of use of force, even if it's just taking somebody to the ground. Everything's reported. Anything at a level of mace, taser on up in the spectrum of uses of force are all investigated, documented, are a public record, are available for review. Everyone in the chain of command reviews those, Training Bureau reviews those, we analyze them for trends. So we're looking at every single use of force. I've also created public corruption, FBI Public Corruption Task Force to look for any critical misconduct that would be at a criminal level. I've also implemented a force investigations responders in internal affairs. In the past, what we would do is the immediate supervisor would come out of an officer and investigate the use of force. If there's something that's a serious injury, a critical nature, something that's a high-profile incident, we now have the ability to bring responders from internal affairs that are outside the chain of command, outside the subdivision of patrol. They're assigned to the public accountability subdivision. They will come out, they will do the investigation, they will reach the conclusion. Then the chain of command must respond to that. So it's a lot harder for them to steer, if you would want to argue that could happen, that they would steer the investigation towards a in-policy finding. Now they're going to have to answer to what the internal affairs found. And that's a lot harder for a sergeant at their level to say, well, we disagree with this finding. This is the finding, what are you going to do about it now? And that's one of the things I've done in cases I've handled. The decision's made. It's out of policy. The only decision for you is what discipline do you recommend out of that, and then that's reviewed as well. Does that answer?
It kind of does, but I think Tiffany had.
There are a lot of new steps in place to address use of force specifically. Okay. Another recommendation is assess and redirect training efforts, develop clear training measures for 21st century policing. And again, I don't think the report really lays out what does that specifically mean, what exactly are we not doing yet that you want us to do. So that gives us some latitude to work with the commission, talk to Matrix, and figure out exactly what it is that you want to see done different. So again, there's a lot of academies around the state that could send their officers for training. A lot of them are free, or some of them are free. Many agencies from pretty far away actually still send their recruits to us to train at a considerable expense, because the training here has, by all measures, gone to a level so far above what other agencies, what other academies can deliver. The agency heads have decided they want to send officers to the Columbus Police Academy to learn the POTA requirements and everything else we bring, the scenario-based training, the ethics, the core values, the legal training, everything else we do that's so far beyond what just the core training is for the state requirements. They've made that conscious choice because of the results they get when people come back are the caliber of officers that much higher. So I think what we're already doing, assessing and redirecting training efforts, I think what we're doing is already at a pretty high caliber. So you had something you're going to ask?
So do you feel that's because of the large investment in policing in the city budget? And we have, I mean, this facility is gorgeous. I think we are state-of-the-art. I believe that wholeheartedly in the nation as it pertains to the amount of money we put into policing. But on the other hand of that, the reason why this commission was formed is because of the challenges that we have, from my perspective, this is a perspective of mine, and how we come into our communities. That's a huge concern. And so I often wonder, and I was shocked over these 14 years to learn just how many surrounding police forces train here and around the country and out of the country. And it concerns me continuously that, are we teaching things, I know we're teaching things that are positive, but are we teaching practices and training? If we have all these lists of things that need to be addressed, have you thought about how that's being implemented in the training that we're teaching officers around the country and around the world? I think that was one of the things that stuck out to me in the report, is that we're training so many people in this beautiful state-of-the-art facility. And so I think the training is a huge thing that we need to focus on, because this has the ability to reverberate here in our city, but also around the world.
Well, you're correct when you mentioned that our city has provided us some of the best resources and the best training opportunities around. There's no doubt about that. However, it really comes down to one thing: the people, the instructors that we have that train our officers, the level of education experience our instructors bring. They're bringing 20, 30 years of experience in a major metropolitan city. Other people go to train with an officer, maybe been on the street 5 years, and they've worked for a 7-officer department and just don't have that wealth of experience. We have many officers in the Division of Police with PhDs. We probably have 20-some or more officers with a JD, a law degree. We have hundreds with master's degrees. Vast majority have bachelor's or associate degrees. The level of education and experience combined that our personnel, our people bring to the training platform, and under the leadership of Commander Meter, everything he does, because the report speaks to this, is trained to policy. Everything he does talks about trained to policy. So again, I just have a bias, but I think we are in a league of our own when it comes to the level of training we provide. Why then does stuff show up here, and why was the commission told about focus on training? Because again, the community needs and expectations change. Policing changes over time, evolves. We cannot be stagnant. If there are new training techniques, opportunities out there, then we are open to reevaluating those and making sure that they're going to be safe. You want to look at things to make sure they're legal, that they're tactically appropriate, and that they're medically appropriate. They're not going to harm anybody. They're tactically sound. They're not going to get anybody hurt, including officers, and that they're legal. So we have to look at those type of things when we decide whether we're going to do a certain type of training technique. So with that, just to kind of go over the 21st century, these are the 6 pillars of the 21st century policing. So we're looking at building trust and legitimacy. Again, we have already done a major reorganization of the division. We've changed our core values. We focused our mission on the community and service-driven. We have enormous amount of community relationship building. We've presented all that to you, so I don't want to go over all that on time. But our policy and oversight, under the CLIA accreditation model, everything is being reviewed annually, and updates come out every month on our policy. We're training the policy. This level of supervision, I agree with Matrix, we need to address some span of control issues. But the supervision we have provides the level of oversight. We're constantly on Twitter and using technologies and all the different social media platforms. Community policing, crime reduction. I have a slide in here on some crime reduction stuff. I'll speak to that in a minute. Community policing, again, we're doing thousands upon thousands. In just 365 days a year, we do over 3,000 community engagement, attendance events a year, in addition to everything else we do. So, we really have an honest commitment to that. Officer training and education, again, we just spoke about that and how where we are at there. And the officer safety and wellness. And with our officer safety and wellness program, we have a bureau that focuses on that now. I'm looking at a lounge in the court, so officers that work all night don't go sit down in court all day, have to be up and sitting in a courtroom all day and then come back to work with almost no sleep. That's a wellness program. I just came back yesterday from the FBI headquarters. They had a therapy dog that they fly out, they use in their headquarters to walk around and talk to their agents and make sure that they're taking care of themselves, because they see the worst society has to deal with. sometimes, and it wears on you over 30 years. They fly them out all over the country to go to wherever problems are, mass shootings, anything to help. We now have that here. They have 2. We have 5 available on all shifts here, and I have them here with me. If Jeff, will you invite them to come on over? I'd like you to meet our new therapy dog unit. What I want to point out about this is something that is almost impossible to do mid-budget cycle. Our budget's done in August for the following year. So in August of 2018, the entire 2019 budget was set. And I didn't get into position until February, so I had to work with what I had. To start up an entire unit of 5 dogs, officers, equipment, training, vehicles, everything is almost impossible until a whole budget cycle later. That's why any recommendation you make, if they're going to cost funding, if we don't get them done like now, by the time your recommendations come, we're going to be looking at the 2021 budget cycle. So we're going to be behind. This was a program through donations, through partnerships with the community. Community individuals have stepped up and paid for everything to do with these canine program. And we're already getting huge successes with these therapy canines. So I want to bring them in just real quick so you can meet them and ask a few questions. They'll be over here in just a minute. I'll move on since in time. So we talked about the crime stats. This is January 1 to June 30 from 2019-2018 comparison. There are only 8 out of 69 cities, the major city chiefs tracks, that had a reduction in every category. Columbus is one of 8. Out of 69 cities, it's supposed to be law enforcement sensitive, so I didn't provide the whole report, but I wanted you to see Columbus is decreasing in every single category. So our crime prevention and community policing crime reduction obviously is working. Can we get to more proactive time? Absolutely. That's where we want to be. We want more proactive time to engage positively with the community, which is one of the reasons we disagree with one of the recommendations, which I'll get to here in just a minute. But you can see where everyone else is increasing. On this page, at least, just Buffalo, New York is the only one that isn't in the red in Columbus Police. So I think that's a testament. Talking about dispatchers and call takers, I think only an increase of 3 is a very critical operation. I think only adding 3 is not because of the turnover they have in that position, the time it takes to train. I think we're doing a disservice by only allowing 3 in that position. We need to increase that and create a proper ratio between dispatchers and call takers. So that just needs more work. Doesn't mean we disagree with it. In total, it just needs more information and review and consideration. So here's one of the things I was going to talk about, the increased frequency of citations. Says we need to write more traffic tickets. Here, we wrote 33,000 tickets. I'm not sure how many more in a year we should be bringing. Come on in. We'll go ahead and take a quick break from the monotony of this. Come on up front here, and we'll introduce you to our new therapy canine unit. And you'll see these are all 30-year veterans that took these jobs. We got Eddie over here with John. We got Lenny. Mattis, we got Sergeant, you might recognize her from our former PIO, Andy, and Simon, and Ollie. So they're welcome to walk around and let you pet them and everything else, or walk around and get to see them. The feedback we've gotten from these animals already, from people in the community, have been astounding. See, they always steal the show.
We have the issues and some of our shelter are adding officers into the schools. Wouldn't this be a good opportunity to bring the kids and the officers together with the dogs as far as addressing issues with gangs and bullying and things of that nature?
one of the actual functions of the dog, we have Officer Pollins, who's
Oh, I'm listening.
Officer
I'm
Pollins is
sorry,
going
I'm
to do
listening.
more of the criminal side of it. We have officers that are going to do the patrol response. We also have officers who are going to be available for schools. And that's one of the things the sergeant will do, go to schools, deal with youth. So it is going to be heavily youth engaged. We've already gone to schools. We went to opening day to a school recently. Big hit. One of the big things with these animals is that when you have a child victim, the child victim is reluctant to open up, especially in a sexual related offense. Shantae, what was the number, Mike? Commander Grizel can answer the improvement you get out of witness cooperation.
So in forensic interviews, with a trained interviewer, a child will disclose their abuse about 34% of the time. Studies have shown that when you have a dog there, the child feels much safer, and that number jumps up to 84% of the time with a therapy dog.
So we've heard stories where you actually get more suspects to confess just because the dog's laying in the room, not even interacting, just laying there in the room. You get better victim testimony. They're with them all the steps of the way throughout the process of the criminal justice process. We also can use these dogs to send a date into a mass shooting if we need. Whatever we need, but they're certainly based for our community, but we hope we don't have anything like that in our community. So this is something that will always be able to be reflective of the community. Andrew?
You're going to use the dogs for your officer wellness program as well, and that you've had success in that. And I'm curious about how you would measure the success of officer wellness and your dogs.
Very good. One of the ways we'll deal with officer wellness and is just decompression, and we have an industrial hygienist that can do surveys. Commander Grizel is running the Wellness Bureau. She'll be able to do work with officers that have experienced the therapy of the canine and those who haven't, and kind of compare and see. It won't be as statistical maybe as Vlad would be able to do, but we will be looking at success stories more than statistical outcomes.
Okay, you just completely distracted me, but thank you.
That was part of the strategy there. This is a response they get everywhere they go. Whatever's going on, it completely disrupts the monotony of what's going on, and people just gravitate towards animals. They were at the zoo, and instead of playing with the wildlife or seeing the wildlife, everybody wanted to come up and play with the dogs. Bob, are you presenting anything? Are you presenting anything? No, I just didn't know if I was using your time up. That's all right. Just so I keep on time here a little bit, I'm not going to beat the dogs, so. You can see what a great resource this is that just we have not previously had. This shows how willing officers with 30 plus years are to find a compassionate policing model and interact in good ways with the community. Try to bring light to somebody's day when we always have to, can you imagine going out and having to do death notification? We have officers assigned to accident investigation, crash investigation, have to go out and tell someone they were killed in a car crash. Heartbreaking is that for an officer? It's tragic for the family, but how heartbreaking is it for an officer to do that 40, 50 times over, a period of 8, 10 years. You take an animal out, just something as simple as a DOA. We find, people wake up and their spouse has passed. We have to do certain things. We have to check the body, make sure there's no sign of, trauma or whatever. There's things we have to do that the officer can't be as compassionate with the person that's heartbroken at the time. We could have a dog respond, and they can take that role up and let the officer do the report, contact the coroner's office, contact the funeral home, do all the other stuff that nobody really wants to do, while the family can deal with the therapeutic effect of the dog. So a lot of great options there. So that just shows you one thing that we're progressive and how willing to change we are. Again, pointing out, I think it was 86 out of 226 sergeants wanted that job. Like 250 officers wanted the 4. Actually, it was only 2 positions, because one of them we had an agreement with the FOP to hand pick one person. We had 2 other positions that 250 people put in for. Uh-oh. Was there some emergency going on? You're okay. Okay. Sorry, I know when there's an emergency coming in based on the way the radio phone is. And then, long story short, we ended up expanding the unit, and so we have 5 available. So anyways, with that said, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm not going to get a clap when I get done, but the dogs get a hand. So, yeah, Vlad, I'm sorry.
Could I ask a question about the citations? And I have to go back and reread the Matrix report, but I think my intuition, is similar to yours. If one of the goals is to increase trust in the community, then having more traffic enforcement interactions is probably not the way to do it. And I remember, certain cities, especially in Ferguson, one of the findings from the Justice Department was that the city was using traffic enforcement as a way to raise revenue, which created a lot of distrust. So again, it seems like this recommendation about increasing citations runs against the spirit of some of the other ones dealing with community engagement and trust and things like that.
Must have been picking up my next slide, because my next slide says if one of the tenets of 21st century policing is about changing the traditional enforcement activity in neighborhoods that have been traditionally over-policed and reducing the enforcement activity and increasing the positive encounters that police have. Issuing traffic tickets is not going to solve that. So one was on traffic officers, this one's on patrol. For patrol, I certainly don't, I'm not inclined right now, based on everything I know, to add more officers to write more traffic tickets in patrol. Again, that's something that, does lead to good arrest sometimes when other things are learned from it. But the idea to write a citation if you don't get a gun out of a car or whatever, again, those are something that we need to maybe use more discretion on, not be more aggressive on. So you're right. To keep with the 21st century policing model that's throughout the report, I don't agree that we need to increase the number of traffic tickets. I think the 33,000 we're writing are probably on par with what would be normal. I don't know that we need to increase that number. So you're right, especially with youth, which would, again, they get a traffic ticket, they don't pay it, they get a warrant, whatever, they get a suspension, they don't have insurance, then they lose their job. It's just perpetual. So not that we won't do our job when we're confronted with it, but it's not something we necessarily want to make a focus or priority. So again, consolidating fire, we've long looked at the idea of call taking for fire, but the idea of dispatching is new. I firmly believe that the police dispatchers and what they do not have the expertise or the competencies needed to dispatch the right apparatus, the hazmat equipment, whether it's a ladder truck or a heavy rescue or medics or a squad. There's a difference between a medic and a squad, actually. One's just a EMT, the other's a paramedic. They can do whole different things. We don't have the expertise to know what the call taker's saying and give the right, so we could be in jeopardizing the safety of the public and the firefighters. So I'm fine taking the call and writing it up, let them decide what apparatuses they send out there and personnel. So that's just where we are at currently on that recommendation. 30 detectives, again, we have 31 co-located. We have 17 robbery, we have 14 that are major burglary investigators under the reorganization, which again, in fairness to Matrix, they looked at it before we made the change. So with the change, we don't necessarily agree with this model, but we've basically accomplished what they recommended. They recommended having 30 total, we have 31, so I think we've done that. Now, they've also conversely said either do this or next create a major crime section combining robbery and assault. Well, we basically did that. We created a major crime section. We kept assault and homicide together. Robbery is still under a separate chain of command, but they're all under the same commander, same bureau. So effectively, we've accomplished that in one model or the other, just how you term it. And transition technical services to all non-sworn. We've already downgraded the bureau to a section, which is a step below a bureau, and it will be headed by a civilian. We have several civilians hired, but we also have officers in there. So as long as Department of Technology has declined to provide the support we need for operational necessities around leads and Premier One, records management, and everything else we do, we just don't have the luxury to bring in non-sworn members that would still understand the complexities of what the officer in the field is doing. So at this time, things may change in the future. It's not that we're saying, no, we'll never do this. We have often asked to civilianize the whole unit. Right now, it's not on the radar right now. Tammy, you had some?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the robbery and homicide. My question was in regard to that. So you're saying that there are 31, can you go back to that slide? I think I
Yes.
saw 31 currently. Between the two, there are 31 detectives. Is that what this is saying?
That's between major burglary crimes and robberies. We still have property crimes that will do some breaking and entering and stuff, but major burglary and robbery combined have 31.
Okay. How do you determine what's major? So some high profile or what?
No, just the level of felony level. If you enter an occupied structure, it's a F1 burglary, they'll investigate. If you break into somebody's detached garage and steal their lawnmower, it's a burglary, it's a breaking and entering, but it's going to go to property crimes.
No, and how does that relate to homicides?
How does it relate? I mean, one thing could lead to another, of course. If it would lead to homicide, then obviously they're going to take over the case.
Okay, so is the 17 number, the number of detectives assigned to homicide and the
No, that's who's assigned to robbery.
robberies? Okay. And
Yeah,
so
the
where did,
second recommendation was to combine robbery and assault squad, which
Okay.
we're combining assault squad and homicide, so they do like offenses.
I see. what you're
Robbery
saying.
will do like offenses. Now, robbery can turn into a homicide, they'll take over, they'll pass it off.
Okay, thank you.
So, just a couple more here, I think we're be able to take some questions. Reduce officer staffing in crime scene search unit, down to 9. We currently have 14 in crime scene and 6 in evidence recovery, so we're maintaining 20. However, they are the ones who are, a lot of times, I don't think the prosecutors, maybe the legal can correct me, I don't think the prosecutors is interested in the detective's testimony or some eyewitness testimony as often as they want the physical evidence that's indisputable, DNA evidence, NIBIN, E-trace evidence from calibers of guns and everything else, to look at homicides, assaults, rapes, robberies, police-involved critical incidents. I don't want to downsize that unit right now based on the level of activity that we're having and still be able to assure that we're going to provide a good, high-quality, defensible product for prosecution and also protect against conviction integrity. It does us no good and certainly doesn't serve the public any if we get it wrong and put the wrong person in prison. So that's another thing that I'm doing right now with Ron O'Brien is creating a conviction integrity team where we're looking at past cases to see have we got them wrong in the past based on new evidence and everything else out there. So we're actually taking that proactive step on our own to try to find, have we messed up in the past and can we fix that now? So I don't want to reduce the number of people we have in crime scene search based on that. It would be too big of an impact. And that we should increase training on policies. So I don't know if that's the right recommendation for us. Commander Meter it's his mantra to say we train 2 policies. Anytime I've come up to him and say, hey, we need to do some training on this, he said, well, what's the policy? That's the first words out of his mouth. He wants to know what the policy is, and we'll train to that. You can't just, throw something together, randomly. It has to have a policy, and we have to train to that. So I think we do a really good job by this. Training on policy, we do through our Power DMS, we do through roll call training. Everything goes out, and in not only in Power DMS, we put the whole policy out, we also put out a summary of here's what changed and here's what you need to know, and we highlight it in the policy. The recommendation for more sergeants, I think, is where we could improve here. That would probably address training on policy by having more supervisors on the street, giving more face-to-face, interactive, on the scene type, hey, this is what we need to do, here's the policy, whatever, as opposed to leaving officers to their own ideas. And then the number of mounted unit officers, kind of like the canines that you just saw, how everybody in the room started talking and changing and ignoring me, which I was happy with. That's who you're focused on. Our mounted unit is the same way. First, it's a very big public relations model for us. It's very important to us. The other thing, our entire response is set up around our bicycle response team, set up around a mounted unit interacting and co-locating with them. So they'll come and clear a street when we have a demonstration or something. They'll clear it. The bikes will hold the ground that they gain. It's a force multiplier. It's too big of an investment on our part for what we gain out of having. I can literally take one mounted unit officer on a horse and replace 10 officers on a line. So I think, and we have 7, there's 70 officers we can put back on the street doing proactive policing and responding to emergency calls for service, and not have all 70 standing there in on a line in a protest situation. We can have 7 horses and accomplish the same thing. So that's the area on there. And then the other things added sergeant to mayor's security detail. There's only 3 officers there. Officer Woody Gordon Faye Gordon is the sergeant that they report to now. He's one of our most senior sergeants. He's been a sergeant for 26 years. He's been on the department longer than 26 years. He's been a sergeant for 26 years. He only has 12 direct reports, and I don't think he's very inclined to override directions the mayor gives his security detail to say, no, as a sergeant, no, we're not going to do that, you do this. He takes care of their training, their overtime, their budgets. He takes care of what they need, but he's not going to operationally oversee them. So I think the span of control is okay there. I would rather keep supervisors fixing the span of control where we have the least senior sergeants overseeing the least senior officers. These are the most senior officers. One of them's out of my class, in fact, Jerome Stevens, led by one of the most senior sergeants in the division. So I just disagree that we need to, respectfully disagree that we need to make any changes there. So the very first slide I showed you the X up there on the thing of what's missing. So I think the report is responsive to what the request for service was. I think they delivered on that. There's certain things that only 9% that we disagree with. They say it's normally 20. I think that's probably good. 53% we've already implemented, so I think we're way ahead of the game there. But this may be where you can come in. What is not addressed in the matrix report that needs to be addressed? And the commission is a perfect spot to address some of those issues. Now, again, I did this at 8 o'clock last night on an airplane back from DC, so I just threw some ideas out there right off the top of my head. There's certainly a lot more thought can go into this, but there's not a lot in there about mental health response plans and crisis intervention teams. We created a full-time mobile crisis response team now. So we have 7 officers out there with trained clinicians and actually out there in the field responding. And they're also doing proactive follow-up. So they may not even get a call. They may just stop by and say, hey, we were here 2 days ago. How you doing? Did you get your medications? So there's going to be a lot of improvements there. Firearms, school threat assessments. We get requests for those all the time. Domestic violence. You know, what are we doing on those fronts? Proactive officer response in business districts and entertainment districts. The fact that Dayton was able to respond immediately is because they had special duty officers there and they had a long gun there. That's the only reason that person didn't kill a lot more people. 36 seconds, and that ended. But still, several dozen people shot and some killed. So we need to have neighborhood coordination officers, and part of that is I think we need to find a way to infuse officers into the entertainment and business districts. That's what drives the financial base of the city. I think if we ignore those areas, and everybody can think back to City Center Mall, if we ignore areas around the city that are our foundation of our financial base, and we don't have a police presence there for all the different things that are going on around the city every day and every weekend, then we're missing, you know, an important aspect of policing in Columbus. Conduct security assessments for community and education, like synagogues is an example where, you know, people want to know, what can we do? How do we resolve this threat? How do we respond to these threats? Less lethal weapon policies. We did address crowd mace, but we'll address that in a different forum. But less lethal weapon policies, multi-agency training practices. I mean, there's, down in Dayton, again, every agency around there showed up. FBI showed up. ATF was down there. Marshal Service. People from all over the place are coming. We need to make sure we train it so everyone's doing the same thing and responding the same. So I think there's some stuff when he talks about training and 21st century policing principles. These are some of the areas that we can really focus on. Victim services. I started a victim services program, or will be in the process of that. So I think we're addressing. Right now, the courts have it, but that's once the court starts. What happens before the case is even solved? Who's addressing the victim needs? We're going to take care of that. Task force officers. That's something that was kind of missed about the force multiplier and the resources brought in by other agencies. For instance, FBI, when they come into a scene and they're not taking over the case or prosecuting, they're just providing resources. Their victim services have a credit card they bring with them with a $1 million credit limit on it that they can, if somebody from overseas, say some, God forbid, happened to OSU and somebody, an out-of-country student's hurt there, they can fly a family member over right now. They can give people a hotel and other stuff. We'd go through a whole funding process to do that. So I think, you know, task force officers bring a lot of benefit by being partners with these other agencies. Homeless outreach teams. And the last thing I want to finish with is, it says 96 additional officers. It says 79, but with 17 sergeants, 96 officers. The report doesn't say what we need to stop doing to get to 40% proactive time until we get those 96 officers hired, trained, and on the street. So there obviously needs to be something that we can no longer maybe do or have to rethink how we provide that service. More stuff with our mobile app, taking reports on phone. There's a lot of things. I've heard some agencies actually using a smartphone where you can FaceTime someone. They can take the report and they can actually walk them around their house and show, here's where they broke, whatever. They can decide if they need to send an evidence tech out or whatever, but they can do everything right there on the phone and see what's going on like they were there. That's another way agencies are handling some of the stressors of the staffing. I think there's more things we can do there. So with that in mind, I'll finish with any question you have, sir. I'm sorry, Tammy.
My question is around victim services. How are you defining victim and who is a victim? I know I've done some work with now Governor Mike DeWine's office in victim services. A person with a felony conviction cannot access those services. Oftentimes in low-income and communities of color, people have a conviction, but they are also a victim. And so have you thought about how we as a city are defining who is a victim of crime? Is the question I have around victim services. And then could you talk a little bit about what our victim services support looks like now in your department?
Okay, well, we don't have one right now, so I'm starting one. answer your first question is, I think maybe the response from the governor might be focused on my answering for him, but it sounds like it might be answering on victims of crime funds and who's eligible for money from these different funds. I don't care who the person is in the background. We provide service to people. A victim is a victim. If they file a report and they're a victim, I don't care where they come from, I don't care who they are. I expect officers to step up. If they see an animal being hurt, they step up and do something. So if a person's being hurt, I don't care who they are, I expect our officers to do something. And we'll provide services to them. And again, services are trying to make sure they don't have to play phone tag with people all day long. They can call one place, get someone that says, I'll run those questions down for you and I'll get back to you with those answers. I'll find out who the detective is in your case, where it's at, whether charges have been filed, whether protection orders been on file, whatever. Someone to do the legwork for us so the victim doesn't have to go through all that. That's how we're going to focus on our victim services. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chief, for this presentation as well as for the modified org chart.
Please. No.
So
Okay.
thank you for that. Which is kind of leading to my question. At the onset, you mentioned that for the most part, you now have the matrix report and you've been listening to us talk, by sitting in meetings and having conversations with us now since the beginning, and you've already begun to incorporate, some of those ideas that you've heard into, this plan and,
Yes, sir.
and obviously and into your presentation. So, I actually, think that this is great insight on your behalf to kind of not wait for important things to be incorporated into the Columbus Division of Police Operations. I guess I would like to know what some of those things are that you incorporated, if you can eventually point those out, because when we eventually do our report, I think that we would like to know what kind of things we inspired, you to take a look at, if you don't already have that. Because I think that, we're not quite sure. We don't have, obviously, the codified version of what we're going to present quite yet, but it is imminent. And we're anxious to, when second to your last slide, or pretty close to it, you asked, well, what is not in the matrix report that we should, also take a look at? And I do think that's a good charge to this body, to see if there's something that's not there that we can refine that you haven't already incorporated into your presentation. So just, kind of wanting to clean this up a little bit in terms of kind of what the Division of Labor and the, who came up with what kind of things are. So, but I do appreciate that you've done that.
Well, thank you. That was the idea, because again, we're working on a budget cycle, and so whatever comes out, I'm looking at what can I get done in 2020, or whomever's in this role in 2020, what can they accomplish, and not have to wait for 2021. So I'm trying to get ahead of whatever anticipation there is, knowing that we can make adjustments and tweaks to it based on the commission's report. But again, I mentioned the Public Corruption Task Force officer. We actually have an ability now outside the division assigned to the FBI to do criminal investigations when there's criminal activity that occurs, and they answer only to the chief of police. So I've got that. The Wellness Bureau, again, as part of the 21st Century Policing Pillar, changed the mission statement, again, included community. Have a nice day. Thank you. And we're looking at changing span of controls. One of the things I think that you could really do help with the idea of span of control is my commitment to the officers. Again, I have two audiences, basically, the public certainly and the officers. I have to make sure I speak for both of them as I listen to the public and I represent officers. So, because if officers shut down and go, I'm not doing that, then they're not helpful to the public. So I have to look at both. And looking at both, one of the things that I did was, how do I fix span of controls and without trying to disrupt their lifestyle right now. Right now they have an assignment, a shift, and days off and everything else. While I'm in an interim role, I made a commitment that I was not going to create a redistricting plan and put everybody in turmoil because that may need to be done to address span of control. But if another chief would come in January and go, oh, no, I don't like the idea, I'm going to do something different, then we disrupt people twice. I don't want to do that. So what I'm doing now is I've signed a committee to already do an entire redistricting model to come up with fixed and spans of control. I think if you just look at our raw number of supervisors and the raw number of officers, we have enough to get to a 1-to-7 ratio. But in some places we're at 1-to-17. How do we fix those? So we're working on that plan, but nothing will be implemented until a permanent chief is selected, whomever that may be. So we'll have a model for someone else they can look at and say, I like that, or nope, I got my own plan coming in the door. But if I were to be selected, then we don't have to wait another 6 months to do a whole study. Hey, we're already ready to go with this. Let's implement it. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do there. Again, the public accountability and the first ever community services subdivision, everything was kind of inward facing for us, I think, at some point. Now everything kind of outward facing. We're looking at, again, you can see in the community services subdivision model, but a changed truancy to youth services. It's no longer just a daytime school thing. We're actually looking at now boys and girls clubs, after school locations, things that we can do positively with youth in the community, with victims. Started a cadet program to try to improve our diversity recruiting numbers. That just started last week. Completely revamped the Narcotics Bureau, got rid of ICE, started a whole new Police and Community Together team, changed narcotics to the Drug Crimes Bureau, repurposed a lot of their functions and how they operate. We've added a lot of officers to Human Trafficking Task Force, Domestic Violence Unit, to the Marshal Service to look for really bad offenders in your city, and the DA, because of the drugs and stuff, we're looking at that. We're also looking at the pharmaceutical unit, doing some opiate criminal investigations of opiate uses that led to deaths. Mobile crisis response teams that we've created in the therapy dog unit. We're working right now on a diversion program for youth with the Franklin County Courts and Shuba to do diversion. So they commit a crime. It's not a crime as a juvenile. They commit a delinquent act. They go down. They're going to get whatever the court was going to do to them anyways, but they don't get the conviction on the record. They go straight into diversion, and they do the community service wherever they need, but they don't have that conviction to keep them from a job in the future or whatever. We're doing a citation in lieu of arrest program or summons in lieu of arrest program for nonviolent misdemeanors, where instead of going to jail, you can get a citation and be released with a court date. That'll save a lot of people from going to jail, maybe missing work the next day and then getting fired or whatever. I mean, it's progressive ideas like that we're implementing. I created a Watch Commander program, which before we didn't have anyone after, just say 5 o'clock in the afternoon, anyone in the city other than a lieutenant was the highest ranking person out there that was really the chief of police. They made all the decisions, but there was no control over which lieutenant of the lieutenants we had out. We have 5 in patrol. We might have 1 in crimes against persons. We might have 1 in narcotics, or now drug crimes. Who's in charge? Who makes the final decision? So I started a Watch Commander program where one person has the ultimate authority 24 hours a day to say, this is what we're doing, period. This is the tiebreaker. I'm deciding. That person speaks for me. They report directly to my office. They have my authority at night. They speak for me. They'll make decisions. They also have 1 phone number I can call now. I don't have to call and figure out who's at a scene of something to know what's going on. Director Speaks has 1 phone number he can call now and get a hold of somebody. They can say, yep, I'm out here. Here's what we have going on. So that's a big thing. We also created property crimes under the community services subdivision to be more responsive to the community itself, because that's, of all the community meetings we go to, people complain most about property crimes, believe it or not, or panhandling or homelessness, than what they do about major crimes. So we put them with community services.
Chief, for the essence of time, we're at about 12:20. Just want to make sure that we have time for one or two more questions before we let Richard come up, but and a restroom break, of course.
Can I follow up?
Yes, so let's continue,
Oh,
please.
has a question and you have one.
Just a quick follow-up. I just, so we will eventually have a report. But I think the wealth of what this commission has done is all documented in the minutes. Not everything that's in the minutes is going to find its way into, our report. So I would hope that at some point, the Columbus Division of Police would archive those minutes and have somebody to, review them to see what else the Columbus Division of Police could adopt, even post our report that would go to you. I mean, we've talked about many of the things that you've presented on already, in addition to things like implicit bias and de-escalation and procedural justice. You can go down the list of all the kind of things that we think are important that may or may not find its way into our final submission.
One of the things I like about having Matrix report come out and then yours come out later is if they both came out and hit us one time, we're trying to do a lot of things okay. I'd rather do things well. We can take this report, dissect it, come out with a plan, and do it well, and then look at your report and implement it. If I'm trying to implement everything globally, we do a lot of things good, but we don't do anything very well. So this is actually going to work out better.
So I was about to use my outside voice, but I guess the mic works better. So I have a couple questions about the addition of officers. So in my reading of the report, it appeared that single officer patrol cars were an option. So is that like a safety thing? Because I never heard you mention that as an option.
A couple things. Almost all our cars are one-officer cars. We have a wagon, which is 2 officers because we have to transport a prisoner. We need 2 officers under CLIA, different rules. But anyways, we have a wagon that has 2 officers in it. Almost every other car we have is a 1-officer car. Bikes work in 2-officer units. We have some mid-watch assignments where people partner up because we don't have enough cars to fill as many officers. Again, there's maybe 18 officers showing up at a substation. We don't have enough cars for everyone to have their own individual vehicle. So the idea is, the recommendation is to make more 1-officer cars. That's fine. Again, we'll need funding to buy more cars to accommodate that. But also, the report that just came out on looking at our police-involved shootings, we actually find the majority of those occur in 1-officer cars. So, you have to look at the unintended consequences. If we reduce the number of 2-officer cars, we could increase something unintentionally on another end. So I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying that, we want to look and think through things before we just start moving and shuffling people around.
Oh, absolutely. I wasn't suggesting that one was better, or I was
Okay.
just referencing the recommendation that was
Yes.
made in the report relative to the numbers that you did for the cost of the additional officers. A couple other things. At the beginning, we spoke about the service hours that were provided by the Division of Police in the community, and I had a question about the possibility of developing a more coordinated service calendar, like something that the department, or rather the division, directs, as opposed to what I understood to have been, if I'm an officer, I go to an elementary school and play with some kids, and then I report that, and that becomes part of the 3,000 or more service hours that you report, but a more strategic and coordinated effort around, but you kind of mentioned some of that with the involvement with Boys and Girls Clubs and some of those other things.
Jeff, Lieutenant Love, would you take a note on that? Because that is something that, again, it's random. It's who takes the time to put that in there. There's a lot of stuff we're missing, so you're right on that.
Okay, so this, 2 more things that I'm going to yield. The issuing of citations, after the comma it said warnings, and so I was wondering about your willingness to not necessarily increase the number of citations above the 33,000 or 66,000 that are written with the tickets, but just warnings, especially in these communities where we're working to improve trust. And then lastly, the perception across cultures of animals. So is there a plan in the works to understand the significance of horses to people of African descent, and what that represents in the post-civil rights era and so on and so forth, and in Somalia and communities, Eritrean communities? What do dogs mean in those cultures? So I was just, If it's in
Excellent
place,
questions.
great, but if not, culturally, animals mean different things to different communities, so.
I understand. If I get your first question, or actually the second question was the idea of the tickets versus warnings. I don't know that you're suggesting we increase traffic stops and issue more warnings. I think it's, if I understand it correct, you're saying do the same number of traffic stops, but issue less tickets, issue more warnings, make the ratio more for warnings.
Read,
Okay.
that's what I understood the writing of the recommendation to have been. That's why.
Okay, that's fair. And then on the second issue, your third question was about animals. Number one, you'll never see a police dog in a crowd control situation. And matter of fact, there's a video out there where the county brings one in to one of our situations, and we start yelling immediately, "Get that dog out of there!" Because we do recognize that, we're empathetic to that, and we recognize the error of allowing that to occur. So we will never allow that to occur. The horses, though, are a different dynamic, and again, I will say I don't know the history or culture behind horses as I do dogs in police-related situations, but the value of having a horse where our police dogs, people don't come up and touch other than our therapy dogs because they're aggression trained. You usually have them locked up behind cages in a car, and you don't get to play with them. Horses, people come up and play with all the time. People like them. We get inundated with people coming up and like the animal there. But when they're needed to do something else, they're there immediately available, and they reduce the need for officers to put hands on somebody, which is always a good thing. So we'll have to look at that, but I think the value outweighs the concern maybe. Okay,
And then we'll come back.
okay, thank you.
I had one question about, a recommendation in the matrix report regarding the suggestion of an internal focus group to look at some of the discrimination that minority officers are feeling. And, given the letters, the anonymous letters that this commission received, I just sort of wondered, your feelings on that recommendation and where you stood on that.
The survey that was done, I have concerns with the range. The question wasn't limited to necessarily the last 18 months. It was just in your entire career or whatever. If there's stuff that's come to the commission that's recent, then it's absolutely something that is a concern. I think the bottom line is, especially, this is true for the community, but it's very true for our own officers too. If we have officers who are feeling that they have not had the same opportunities in this division as anyone else or as others, then it doesn't matter, again, if it's one or if it's many, it's a problem for us and something we're committed to addressing, and we're open to some feedback from the commission on different ideas and maybe ways to I don't know what we can necessarily undo. That's a hard question. What can we do going forward to make sure that everyone has the same opportunities in the division? Thank you.
Okay, real quickly, which I was gonna, thank you for the question, that was one of my questions. So, in regard to, in the report on community policing, it speaks to the CPD needs to continue to work on building community trust. There's a whole bunch of other recommendations in this brief version here. On the presentation that you gave, there was a question mark by 21st Century Policing, I think, as it relates to implementation. So my question to you is, do you support, are you in the process of prioritizing a plan to implement 21st Century Policing? Yes or no, or if not, what pieces are you interested in implementing? And then do we have the support of the police department as a whole on this whole section of community policing? I know you mentioned the amount of contacts and the community engagement that the police implements in the city, but this was a huge issue in the report, and it's also has been the focus of our subcommittee, and so that's where my interest is around this particular subject.
I'll point you to the word continue there. It says continue to do what you're doing, continue building.
Where are you pointing me to? I'm sorry.
You said continue to build.
It says the CPD needs to continue to work on building.
Right.
Okay.
So
what is that word?
Well, that's what my question mark was. The report doesn't really say what we're doing now because it says continue doing what we're doing, continue this, but it doesn't really say what we need to do differently. So it leaves some autonomy there for us to find, new practices, new ways of doing things. There's nothing specifically identified that we're doing that's counterproductive or not working towards 21st century policing principles. The reason I put the 6 pillars up there of 21st century policing is we're already addressing every one of those. In fact, I would say arguably we're a leader in our willingness to change and do things differently, whether they're meeting the expectations and demands of the public to all people in the community. That's something we need to study more and evaluate what else we can do, but it shows a willingness and openness to change and find new ways to engage in policing in the city and get rid of this one-dimensional law enforcement concept and look more at a disciplinary policing model. Again, we're putting therapists in cars with police officers. We're putting dogs out. We're doing stuff with victims, victim services. We're doing things that have never been done before. So again, I would argue that shows that we're willing and open to find new ideas and try new things.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll take a 5-minute recess for a bathroom break and come back with Richard. So one last question.
Sean?
My question is about process, and I wanted to understand when you received the matrix report and the 140 recommendations, and got to the point where you had 53% that you agreed with, 9%, and then 38% that you concur with some additional conversation. How did you go about dissecting the report? Like, who was in the room? Who was a part of the conversations? How were they identified? Were you ensured? Was representation equitable at the table to assess and determine whether or not these recommendations applied across the various levels of the division?
Okay, excellent question. What we did was I signed the full report out to every deputy chief, allowed them to meet with their commanders, and they sat down and looked at areas that they oversaw, that they were in charge of, and we prepared a side-by-side, here's the issue that was identified as a recommendation, here's who responded to that, here's who weighed in on it. Of course, they had their commanders and stuff weigh in on as well, and here's the position they're taking on it, and then I reviewed all those as well as Lieutenant Lip and went over line by line and everything and came up with the numbers. We did them in the 4 colors. Green we already have done, yellow we're in the process of, orange we don't agree with, red we're willing to do, we're open to the idea, but we need collective bargaining agreement or funding issues addressed. And that's how we identified those.
And I promise, because the chief mentioned a few times the concept of a multidisciplinary process, and totally agree that it takes a village to create a multidisciplinary process. And in your overview of the slide of what else needs to be done, the only community stakeholder that I heard was the juvenile court and SHUBA, who's working with kids and trying to divert them from the juvenile justice process, which is absolutely necessary. The other processes or the other steps that you were mentioning that you want your department to address also requires additional partners in terms of social services and other types of agencies. And so my concern in having participated in this process is that at times there are very siloed thinking, both internal and external. And so just asking you to think about, and perhaps in a different meeting, how you are breaking through the silos to incorporate that true multidisciplinary policing model, and who those stakeholders will be to make it sustainable and make it realistic and true impact and change in the community. So that was my final comment. Thank you, Adam.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. It is 12:35. Does everyone feel 5 minutes is reasonable? Do we need to extend that time period? 10 minutes? 5 periods is good? 5 minutes is good? All right, we'll see you back at around 12:40.
Restrooms are out the door to the left.
Thank you, everyone. We are back from recess. It is around 12:43. Richard Brady from Matrix is next up to discuss the report. Richard?
I'm actually here to answer your question. So
Answer
this
some
is
questions.
Richard Brady.
Answer
I've
some
met
questions.
all of you, I think, before at one meeting or another, or other opportunities. So I'm here to answer the questions you may have about the report. Glad.
So thank you. So I was hoping to get a little bit more clarification on the use of force finding and kind of the interpretation of that finding and the kind of the recommendations related to it. Because there's discussion of education and training. And so is the intent to suggest that a lack of training or problems with training are leading to these disparities? I guess I'm trying to understand the connection between the recommendation and the process that generates the disparities that you find.
That's a good way to ask the question. I appreciate that. So I think it goes back to the chief's discussion about the areas that we disagree on. And first of all, let me say that usually when we're at this point in the study and we're talking about disagreements, there's a lot more hard no's associated with this. I think those were mostly pretty soft no's. I think we're really talking about the same thing. I think on this issue, I think a lot has been placed publicly on the word significant, and we weren't meaning to place a statistical significance on this finding, that there was a difference. What we wanted to, that was one data point in a lot of data points that we had in this report, and there was much effort put into understanding the differences in perceptions that led to a finding like that. So there were findings associated with policies and training and things like that that I'll talk about in a second. But when you are talking about the statistically significant community survey that we did, which was supported by the community focus group meetings, the employee survey, and the employee focus group meetings, that there are widespread perceptions externally as well as internally about differences in treatment. Externally, those related to not just use of force, but escalation in a situation, even if it didn't go to force, about behaviors, treatments, and things like that, that we got a lot of input on. Internally, some of the same kind of things, as well as impacts on assignments, promotional opportunities, and things like that. So those perceptions were widespread. Those are widely reported in about 80 or so pages in the report, and that was an important starting point for us. But as we went through our work, there were other findings relating to things like policy. One example that led to some specifics were things like use of pepper spray in public assembly types of situations. They're related to things like training on de-escalation approaches, which you are doing right now, and but we recommend more of, and really a process that involves the community more extensively than it does before. And I think this gets back to the question of what is 21st century policing, because 21st century policing is not a checklist. In each of those 6 areas, there are not 100 things that a department does that check off that we are doing these things. It is really a process that it has to be appropriate to each community with some principles behind it, and 21st century policing does talk about that. But the specifics about it are largely left to the community to implement to address its deficiency, and, as the chief said, continue. So I think that gets me to the first area that you disagree. We don't really disagree, because it really is taking a strong department and making it stronger in each of these areas with the impact of over time reducing these perceptions of disparity in many things, including use of force.
Just a clarification, I think that's really helpful. And so that's exactly kind of why I'm so interested, because I think perceptions are going to be driven by your report.
Sure.
So it's kind of like
a
feedback cycle. So I guess the question for me is, if we implemented everything in the report, is the expectation that there would not be disparities in use of force relative to population? Because that seems to me an unrealistic benchmark.
Yeah.
And if that's
it
an
is.
unrealistic benchmark, then I think we need to be really careful about kind of the interpretation that we
Right.
give to this data.
Right. Hopefully, over time, there is less use of force overall, and hopefully, to the extent that there is a disparity, that it would be reduced over time as well. And not just use of force, but there would be more positive interactions with the police division regardless of the context. And that gets at another one of those things. It's warnings plus citations, because a warning can be a positive impact in something that you do want to continue to be involved in, and that is the continued safety of people in traffic situations, either as pedestrians or as drivers. So that's what we're saying. Yes.
So just as a follow-up to what Chief Quinlan shared earlier, he mentioned that there was there were, and I didn't see any constraints on like when people said they had these experiences of, the use of force or when they formed their perception that there were these disparities. So is that something that you considered? Because if like 20 years ago, you joined the force and you had these experiences early on and you've been holding on to that, and then you express those now, how do you account for that?
Yeah. So actually, the survey did ask employees within the previous 5 years. So it wasn't open-ended. So, I mean, 5 years is still a long time.
That's not accurate. It was not 5 years. It was an open-ended question. After we met with the city attorney's office, you sent me a copy of the survey. Mr. Clark did it. It did not limit it to 5 years.
For witness or experience?
Experience.
Okay, because I think that witness was 5 years.
Yeah, I reviewed that. It said,
Yeah.
it basically, have you ever?
Okay.
And so it could be 25 years
Okay,
ago.
sorry
I'm
about
not-
that.
I'm just
But
saying.
But it did
Right.
raise a valid question in my mind.
Sure.
That if that happened to you 30 years ago.
Sure.
And then you express it today.
Right.
Because that does qualify as ever.
It doesn't demean the fact that they
Right.
feel that. I'm just saying, it didn't give a last 2 years, last 5 years.
Right. For that question.
Yeah, it didn't limit the time period, so it could be the employee experienced that 20 years ago or a year ago, we just don't know.
Right. So
So
remember,
just-
we also had the employee focus group meeting. So we were able, in an hour or so, to get into, well, most of them were longer than that, to get in specifics about those issues.
So thank you, Mr. Furby, for saying that it doesn't diminish the fact that they had that experience, because that's kind of what I'm going for here, is that the idea that people of color know that this stuff happens, but for some reason there seems to be a need for it to be proven statistically in order for it to validate the fact that we have these lived experiences. And so that's the question that I have is, to your point, when will we get to the place that my lived experience is valid and that the empathetic response becomes one of policy or can move to policy, that we're not just looking at, if I can prove it mathematically, then it is true. Because I think that a lot of times we use that in reverse, that since it can't be proven to be within 0.05 statistically significant, that it's invalid. And then we're stuck with trying to find another way to express this lived experience and change it.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think that gets at the heart of the holistic concept behind 21st century policing. And that's why 21st century policing does not set a goal of X% of satisfaction or any outcome associated with it, is that it's about the partnerships that are supposed to exist between law enforcement and with the community. And when there are significant bars based on whatever, whether it's ethnicity or living experience or other kinds of preferences, that these are important things that have to be addressed. And that whether it's who we're recruiting, how we're training them in the academy, how we're reinforcing that in field training, how we reinforce that every year, the important issue about first-line supervision, policy and leadership, all of these things come together to say that these are the kinds of behaviors, this is the kind of interaction and partnership we want with the community. And it's based on positive interactions, consciously developed and supported on an ongoing basis within the police division.
I don't know if this, yes. So how much, and thank you for that, just expanding upon that point around perception, how much, I guess for both, I forget your name, I'm sorry.
Richard.
Richard. And for you, Chief Quinlan. So we understand, there's a lot of research that has been done. I was just recently on a panel with Ohio Public Defenders at their annual summit with Brooke, one of the commissioners, that spoke to youth perceptions with police. And so there's a whole body of research that talks about young people will choose to fight, to flight, to withdraw. There's a whole bunch of research that says young people's perceptions are so important. And I often raise, and I have to raise it again, young people are defined, youth are defined in juvenile court as 18 to 25. Okay, so we're talking about people that in policing you may see as an adult, youth are to 25. And so their perception is negative, oftentimes they have a negative perception of police, and so their reaction becomes driven by that perception. And I think that we have to be intentional about how much, especially around training with our officers, that they understand that. And then you layer in families. We just recently came through an incident with a whole family, the Robinsons, families' perceptions. And so all that builds upon itself that creates a lot of the conditions that exist to get us to these perceptions. I don't think we've done enough about really understanding lived experiences, especially in communities of color. And so my hope is that as we begin to pick this thing apart and we put forth our recommendations, that intentionally, we really get really intentional about that first pillar. Because if we're going to get to the outcomes that we seek, we have to, even if we don't agree with perception and we don't believe it, or if we believe it's junk science, I think as a body, as this collective team, all of us have put in a lot of time and effort, we have to realize that perception is a reality for most people.
Yeah.
One of the things that we are doing that's part of the Matrix report is looking at developing greater use of community members in our training. So it's not just police officers training other officers, but community members training. So some of those lived experiences can be brought to light to an officer and maybe have that moment of, oh, okay, now I understand what I didn't understand before. So that is part of the new training protocols we're working on.
I think the other thing, and I agree with everything you're saying and everything the chief is saying too, because you are making those changes, that the reason why we are very insistent about a process that involves community planning with the community is critical, and it is a change for the Columbus Division of Police, and it's new to many police agencies around the country, that too often community engagement is in the positive part of it. It's problem solving with the community, but in community meetings and in other venues, it's informing the public about what we're doing and getting input on that. So we're talking about a true partnership where you're bringing the needs of specific communities to the police division's attention and working with them to develop approaches that are appropriate for that community, so that we've got, in some small ways and big ways, depending on what it is, differences in policing depending on different parts of the community, because different parts of the city need different kinds of interactions. And that's what makes, one of the things that makes law enforcement tough. George.
I'm just curious, you've done so many of these reviews through many decades of work. Overall, summary, how do we stack up?
This is a really fine police department, division, excuse me. So nobody's 100%. It's a journey. There's no destination because things keep changing, as the chief said. So you've got some changes to make, but you are making those changes. The issue that we found in this is in part because of the first line supervision and because it's a large law enforcement agency, is the disconnect or the inconsistency or the comprehensiveness on these policies as it gets translated to the line level. And that's a problem for any large agency. That's why I think the first line supervision issue is one of the more important recommendations in the report. You're always going to have that disconnect without better levels of supervision.
I do have another question about, I was hoping you could explain a little bit better what you guys envisioned when you said a better collaboration between emergency dispatching for 911 and fire. Like, have you seen that in other cities? And,
Sure.
And what does that look like in its most efficient form?
Okay, so the way not to think about it is that you're sitting down there dispatching, and 1 minute you're dispatching a police call, and the next minute you're dispatching a fire call, or you're doing those things simultaneously. What a consolidated dispatch center does is it's a centralized place for calls, so that you receive the 911 call or from other means, and for one side or the other, depending on who's taking those calls, you don't have that delay of getting the information and transferring the call to something else. There's an important sometimes safety, but also a connection that doesn't need to happen. So a consolidated dispatch center has consolidated management, first of all. So we've got a consolidated way of looking at police, fire, and emergency medical and other kinds of emergencies, and consolidated policies that involve, for large incidents, all 3 or 4 of public services as part of that. You consolidate the technology, the way of dealing with those kinds of issues as well. So the way it works at the line level, at the dispatcher level, is one of 2 ways. Either you have separate workforces that are co-located for purposes of dispatching, or you use the different experiences that police and fire represent and train and support the dispatchers so that they can rotate between police and fire, say every week or every month, or usually shorter periods than that, so that you're on police side, you're not constantly going call to call as you would be in a dispatch center, and you're able to work in a fire environment where they are major calls and a lot of units are responding, but it doesn't happen as frequently as a major call for service does in police. So the creative ones manage it in that way, but it's not consolidated in the way that you handle anything that comes in.
Well, we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so before we do wrap up, are there any last questions? Seeing none, I think we're good.
I am too. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today in attendance. This is being recorded, so it will be uploaded online at some point. Thank you.